Water tower place. Do they still have the great laminar sheets of water when you go up the escalators? I love that. I love to play with that. I'm just like the kids, you know. It's like, oh yeah, this is great. So that's laminar water. It wants to flow as a sheet. Okay, when it does that, it's got enough velocity that it's bound up all of that sediment into that flow. So it's not falling out of suspension. But as soon as you go into turbulence, now you start to harvest sediment. So we can go to the next slide, Ken. Thanks for your job on this. You're doing a great job. So talk about a poster child for laminar flow. They've designed these things so they just slip through the water, right? But if you look behind it, one of the things that old submarines used to do is they created a signature because of the turbulence of that converging water. So if you ever go to San Diego, to where the submarine bases are now, you'll always notice that the back end of the submarine is covered over so that from aerial observation you can't see the configuration of the propellers that diminish or deplete the signature of the submarine to nothing. So you can't find them in the ocean, which is pretty cool. And it's because of that turbulence that they dissipate. So we can go to the next. Again, water coming out of a hose makes me think of, and again, I won't bore the students or bore you guys with the whole thing about corrugated pipe. That's against the law in Wisconsin, but plumbing code in Wisconsin and in Illinois to use corrugated pipe for stormwater. You have to use smoothbore pipe, either HDPE or PVC, but you guys all knew that. That's one of the things that we know in Wisconsin, but landscapers haven't discovered that up there. So the landscape architects know, but the landscapers haven't. And so it freaks me out when I go to a project and I've spec'd PVC or HDPE that I've sized perfectly for the amount of capacity that I need for that. Oh, now I'm sounding like an engineer. Oh my gosh, that's scary. But I've sized them right, and there'll be this corrugated pipe that should not be on the planet, and they're trying to put it in place of the PVC or HDPE. So anyway, you can see that the inside deformation does that.
What's wrong with corrugated?
Oh, really? Whoa, yeah, okay, now we're ready. You guys all heard me, right? I was kind of trying to avoid this, but I'm so glad you asked that question. Thanks. Okay, so as water flows across the surface, and this is always where I draw on a board, it tries to flow in a laminar fashion, smooth sheet. Think about water tower place, right? It's a smooth sheet of water. That's how it wants to flow. So if water's flowing down a slope, it's laminar. Now, if we put in a corrugation, say it's a handicap, the warning strip before a handicap slope, right? So it's got the striations in it, or maybe it's a handicap striations and then beyond that is some brick. And then it goes back to concrete again, or asphalt. It goes from laminar flow. Now, if you were to tent that water, what you would see is it goes straight over this, then as soon as it hits the corrugations, it tumbles. So the water tumbles over the abrasions. It'll tumble over the bricks with a little larger amplitude than over the handicap warning strips. And then once it gets back onto the smooth surface again, it eventually returns to laminar flow. Okay? So what happens when it's tumbling is it's going the same velocity. It's not picking up any speed. In fact, it's trying to lose speed because of the coefficient of friction of the handicap striations. Well, as soon as it hits that, when it hits the top of that tumble, it's gone about 2 to 3 times the distance, depending on how fast the water's moving. The sediment falls from suspension. So that's why whenever you see those handicap strips by a walkway, they're always full of debris. It's because the coefficient of friction of those has been great enough to cause that tumbling, and sediment falls from suspension, so that ultimately when the water gets back to the next smooth stretch, it's actually got less sediment in it than it did at the beginning. So it's one of those sequences or series of sediment harvesting. Okay? So if you think about that, now the sediment that falls out of suspension into those striations, those ditches, actually has a higher coefficient of friction than the ditches did themselves, right? So it draws more sediment than just the simple striations did. So more sediment falls out of suspension to the point that now water won't flow down there. It'll actually divert around the handicap entrance. And the sad part of that is if somebody's coming up there that is handicapped, they have to roll over that bump to get off the street. Okay? So now if you take that same image and now go on the inside of a corrugated pipe, what do you have? You have a series of those very same striations. So any of the sediment that's in your suspended water, that's suspended in that flow, is going to fall out of suspension into those corrugations. You can't power wash it out because it's ineffective to do. You can't roto-rooter it out because you'll pull your whole pipe out. And so typically, this is probably a sore point with a lot of folks, but I say that's just job security for landscapers. Because now that fails, and the only way you can fix it is go and dig it up and replace it. But what do they replace it with? The good people of Wisconsin end up saying, oh, you know, it just fails. They needed a new one. So they put in new corrugated pipe. No, don't do that, because you had to tear up all the plants and the stuff above it that grew now. Not good, not good. So I'm a cynic about that, right? So that's the reason I use smooth bore pipe, because not only can I design that pipe so that it'll scavenge the pollution out, but if it's even oversized by mistake, you can pressure wash it out, or you can roto-rooter it and get the sediment out of there. Does that help?
Still round it out if it's corrugated.
If you're lucky, you can get some of it out. Well, here's another one that I face a lot when I talk to installers about that, and they'll say, "Well, you know, California boy, it freezes here." Oh, does it ever freeze here? But here's the thing: I've got PVC pipe, Schedule 40, so it's 200 pounds per square inch resistance. It's really hard to break. I have it on the edge of Geneva Lake at George Williams College, one of the first projects I did from my office in Wisconsin. Been in place now for over 22 years. And the ice dams off of that lake will be about 6 feet right next to this PVC pipe. That's the exact same PVC pipe in place that's lasted all those years. And so when folks tell me it freezes here, I say, yeah, so you got this frost heave, right? Well, there's no memory to corrugated pipe. So it's never going to return to flat again. So when I design a pipe, it's 1 or 2% slope, so I can get the sediment through there and the water through there predictably. And that pipe next to Geneva Lake is exactly the way I placed it that long ago. It still functions greatly. But if it was corrugated, how many times have you been on a site and you've seen corrugated pipe that goes up and then south again? Once it heads north, that's the second thing that my students learn as sophomores. Water doesn't go uphill. It takes a lot of pressure, again, maybe a drip out of it, but it's ineffective in that way. So to me, one of the challenges I give my students early on as sophomores, I say, you're going to have to form your decision. This may take you the rest of your career to answer this question. I actually have two questions that have the same kind of scary background. Is that you've got to decide what your own definition of sustainability is. So when you come up with your definition of sustainability, you've got to live with that and be happy with it, because nobody else has one. You've got your own, and that's really critical that you come up with that, because then you can make your projects resonate around that and make them effective. So for me, the idea of having a product that I'm going to bury, that I'm going to count on to take water where I want it to go, not where it is already, but diminish it and put it back in the environment or water things with it subsurface. I'm going to bury that and I'm going to plant over it. I'm doing all kinds of stuff. To me, it's not sustainable to have to go in and destroy all that planting, screw up the soil structure that I finally recreated, get down to that pipe, and then replace the pipe. To me, that's not sustainable. I like the idea that most of my drain systems, if not all, will last an awful lot longer than I will. And that's a good thing. I said that to a client the other day and they started laughing. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm getting old. That was really spooky to me. I didn't see that one coming. I've been saying that since I was 20, so anyway. So that's kind of a rough flow, so we can go to the next one. This is starting to talk about some of the opportunities. And water movement is really similar to air movement. So when we talk about harvesting sediment, that top one is a wing. Basically, thrust plus force is greater than, thrust plus lift is greater than drag plus weight. And that's the recipe for flight. That's why that wing works, because now you create a high and low pressure area. You've got sediment that's not being diverged, but it comes back to the back. That is really effective flow meter. But if we start to do some of these things, what we start to do is we can now start to harvest the sediment that's in that roiling water behind it, the back of the submarine without the right prop. That's where we get our sediment to drop out of suspension. If we have a beautiful submarine, there's no sediment that we can harvest because it's all shooshed away, it's gone. There's no signature. When we create that signature, you get sediment. So you can imagine any one of those patterns over those handicap walkways that we talked about. You can see those are effective sediment harvesters. So it becomes one more step in that process. Okay, we can go through that. This is sort of the same kind of idea. Again, of creating that turbulence, and if you can do it in multiple conditions, if you have repeated events where you can harvest sediment, now all of a sudden when you finally have that water, now you can recharge it and you've got pure water. You can put it into your storm scepters. You can put it into subsurface recharge without filling up all the voids. See, one of my pet peeves, and this is okay, so we've all done this, I know, created a swale near a parking lot that harvests the water. We can tip all the parking spaces to dip into that. But one of the things that I teach our students to do is to put sediment collection devices between the plant area, where the swale water collection device is, and where the water is coming from. Because if we don't do that, that sediment plugs up the pores in the soil and the plants are going to die. It's just that simple. There's no magic to it. That's the other thing that I tell my students as sophomores, everything goes somewhere. And that's the truth. Everything goes somewhere. So let's get that sediment collected and taken care of, so as part of a device. Basically talking about, an interesting thing I found again in more research was that as soon as water becomes cold and saline, so think about all of our salted streets, the flow characteristics, it's even slipperier. It even moves faster and it's more tricky to harvest. It's trickier to get sediment out of suspension in cold, saline water. Who saw that one coming? I don't want to talk about cold and saline. Let's go to the next. I like the warm, you know. I did a talk up at Colder and we were going by these forges. And for some reason they were talking about how it was like 700 degrees in the forge. I somehow felt really comfortable and at home. And I think it's because I'm from Arizona. I was like, God, this is great. I can do this when I retire. I want to work in the forge. So laminar flow, turbulent flow, you can start to extrapolate the idea of the bottom of a sink with a coffee filter in it to any project you do and start to think about how you can create these treatment trains for water.